talking about all of those indicators of early maltreatment and trauma hopefully leads us all onto the question of what do we do about it. And I hope that David and I are going to talk to you about two ways that we've developed at the centre of tackling some of these issues for a section of this group of children. It's actually quite shocking still, I find, to think about the actual number of children that we're looking at who have these early adverse experiences. What I'm going to focus on in this talk, though, are the group of children who don't stay with their birth parents and go into care. I'm going to particularly focus on a programme called Reflective Fostering, which is for children who are in foster care. But I do just want to mention a couple of other projects that we have currently at the Anna Freud Centre. I'd say one of the main areas of our focus of clinical work and research, because this work really represents a combination and integration of those two fields at the Anna Freud, I should say National Centre for Children and Families, not Centre. But we have a number of projects that don't just focus on foster children, but we have a collaboration also with Quorum, which focuses on children post-adoption. And we also were just discussing today in our STAMS meeting, developing a project for looking at children who are returned to their birth parents, who have perhaps been through proceedings, have been through this early traumatic experiences that we've been thinking about earlier with Jason, but are returned to their families. And of course there's a question then of how do those children who have been chronically neglected or abused by the person who's meant to be offering them their protection and care, how do we re-establish a relationship, and what kind of approaches might we want to develop to try and promote that secure attachment that we're so desperately trying to give those children. So that's sort of something, that's a kind of taster, if you like, for a future talk. That's an area of work that we very much want to develop. So for today, I'm going to focus on this programme, Reflective Fostering Programme. I'll explain the title as we go through because it has some words in it that may or may not be familiar to people in this group, because it's really focusing on an approach which draws its programme and its theory from something called mentalization, which may or may not be a new term to people in the room. So I'm going to do a little bit of explaining what that is. If this wasn't such a formidable setting, I would ask for audience participation, but I may get some audience participation from you. But I want to really talk about, very briefly, what mentalizing means and why I think, and many of us at the centre think, this is such an important concept for thinking about children who really perhaps don't know how to form an attachment relationship, haven't had an experience of security ever in their lives, and maybe don't even understand how relationships work at all, because that is something that I'm sure a lot of you in this room come across every day, are the kind of children and young people, because this programme focuses on 4 to 11-year-olds, but really our work more generally goes right up to 18 and beyond, because children, as you know, in care are going right up into their 20s. But one of the things that we know is really difficult for this group of children is to feel not just a sense of safety with somebody else, but to really feel understood, not just by another, but a capacity to understand themselves. And so we're really focusing in on how do we help this group of children to be able to understand relationships, to have a relationship that's healthy and supportive, and one that really helps them to understand themselves, first and foremost, to feel understood by somebody else, secondly, and then thirdly, to be able to form relationships with other people in the future. Because one of the other features of children who come into the care system is often that not only have they not had a good experience with their primary attachment figure, if they've had one, but they don't have a very good experience with their peers either. And so the approach of mentalizing, of which I've just listed a few core components, is really about understanding self and other. It's about the separateness of minds, that we're not just talking about when we work with foster carers how they might understand the child, but how the foster carer really understands their own state of mind and how that impacts on the child. And I really do feel strongly that not just as an intervention, but in terms of thinking about matching for children's placements and thinking about what children really need, we've got to think about the foster carer's qualities as well as the features of the child. We do an awful lot of assessment of foster carers, and we do an awful lot of assessment of children trying to get this right match. But one of the things I'd really like to see more of is thinking about the foster carer's state of mind and what they're bringing into the relationship. And mentalizing is really all about that. thinking about what capacity does this carer have to not just think about what the child might need, but to think about how they stand in relation to that child. Because it's the fit between those two that makes the relationship work. If I was to mentalise you all right now, it's a bit of a risky sort of strategy. I might think you either kind of gripped in the kind of, sort of wonder of this talk, or you might be sort of itching to hear David Trickey's talk because you heard that he gets really good ratings for his talk, and so kind of eager to get me out of the way. Or any number of things in between there, like how am I going to get home this evening? But I wouldn't know because I can't see into your minds, but I would have a jolly good go perhaps of guessing the kind of things that might be going on in your mind right now. And what I'd be doing when I do that is really trying to mentalise you, trying to use my own mind to kind of try and relate to what might your experience be right here and now of me. And even though it sounds like such an ordinary, commonplace thing to be doing, it's surprising how little we do it. We're probably doing about 30% of the time if we're doing it well. Children who come into foster care maybe have never had that experience of someone doing that very well for them. They might actually have had a really adverse experience of someone looking into their mind or looking at them and seeing something that actually, isn't pleasant as far as they're concerned, and reflecting that back to the child. And that's deeply traumatising for children. Okay, so why is this concept of mentalising important for children looked after? Well, here's a picture of a brain. We know that when children experience trauma, that actually they become highly, highly stressed, very, very aroused. And the thing about mentalising that's key here is that when we're highly aroused, we lose our capacity to mentalise. We lose our capacity to think about what's going on in our own mind and other people's. So, for example, any of you here that had a terrible journey because of the tube and because of incident in London this afternoon, you might not have been thinking so clearly about what you were going to get out of this afternoon. You might have been worrying about how you're going to get home. Or you might have just been very, very stressed, and that might have been your main preoccupation is I'm late, or I don't know how I'm going to get home. But you probably weren't thinking very, very clearly, whereas if you've had a nice, easy journey here, you arrived on time, got yourself a coffee, sat down, started thinking about the afternoon, and made a few notes and sent a message home, and your partner says, I've got a lovely takeaway waiting for you when you get home. You might have been feeling in a kind of, medium to low state of arousal, which would allow you to think probably quite freely about the afternoon and what you might be expecting from it or hoping from it. And you'd be in what I would think of as a kind of mentalising range. Children who are extremely traumatised, stressed and over-aroused aren't in that range. They're really usually somewhere near the top of a kind of highly aroused state, which means that their ability to sort of think things through, their ability to think about their own thoughts and feelings, never mind somebody else, is extremely limited. This has a significant impact on lots of areas of their functioning, not including their attention control, affect regulation, meaning how they control their feelings, and their capacity to kind of think about other people. And this capacity to mentalise and this sort of loss of mentalising is often triggered by the smallest thing. So for us, whereas it might be something, a major event that might sort of send us offline, if you like, for a child who's experienced early trauma, particularly kind of frightening experiences and arousing experiences, their ability to go offline happens much, much quicker. And so I'll give you an example of that. In a school, you might find a looked after child who'd had an early experience like this. A teacher looks at them in a certain way and they experience that as very frightening. They experience that as very, very persecuting. I've got a little slide that might sort of show you that. So this illustration kind of, I think, very neatly shows you what a looked after child might see in the face of a carer, which wouldn't necessarily be that carer or that teacher's intention. So behind this kind of little mirror, if you like, is what we might see, or the person who's feeling it is trying to convey, which could in this instance be quite a neutral face. What the child who has lost this capacity to mentalise sees is something, sometimes, not always, but something that doesn't quite match the emotion. And I haven't got time today to kind of go into a long lecture about why that is, but it's essentially because they haven't had their own state of mind reflected back to them at an early stage. So this face doesn't really make sense to them. And their response, because it's quite adaptive, is to be either defensive or go on the attack. because actually when people kind of flee, it's a bit of flight or flight sort of response really, when people sort of go to this very automatic mentalizing position where they're not able to think things through but make an assumption, it's usually a defensive strategy, which is functional for some of us in some areas of our life. So if I was walking down a dark alley at night and I saw a gang of men coming towards me, I might immediately get my key out as protection, or I might turn and run. That would be adaptive. But actually, I'd hope not to be in that state of mind most of the day. If you imagine a child who's experienced early trauma, they might be in that state of mind for much of their day and be on a kind of hyper-vigilant alert, if you like. Okay, so I'm going to skip to the programme. That's the theory. There's more slides on that, and I realise I've done too much on it. What we're trying to do in this programme, and I'm pleased to see Louise here today, who was part of the NSPCC's sort of group of innovators, if you like, of this project. We at Freud, together with the NSPCC, have developed a programme to try and really promote this mentalising capacity in foster carers. So we're not seeing the children, actually we're not seeing the children at all, we're working only with the carers to try and increase their capacity to mentalise the child, to try and give the child in their care an experience of feeling understood, of being held in mind, and of just being interesting to them in a way that helps them to help the child to understand what it is that they're thinking and feeling, and hopefully give them some experience of being, having a carer who's in some way contingent with their own state of mind. So what we're doing is we're supporting foster carers to build relationships with children, to hopefully promote placement stability. That's our ideal outcome for this study. So we have an evaluation attached to this programme, and that's led by a team in our centre called Chapter, who are doing some great research in this area, not just with looked after children, but with lots of other projects. And so our evaluation will look at a number of measures, pre and post the programme, in terms of foster carer stress. How stressed are they? How competent do they feel? How reflective are they about their child? What's the child's behaviour like? And just how stable is the placement? And then we'll look at those things again at the end of the programme. In terms of what they'll actually do, foster carers will come to groups. They'll come to a group every week, sometimes every fortnight. And these are in 2 sites across the UK. One's in Gillingham and one is in Sheffield. And we're going to have 2 groups running on each site with foster carers who have children in their care age between 4 and 11. And part of this is meant to be preventative. So we're hoping to capture mainly children who are in the first 6 months of their placement, with the aim of increasing this sense of being felt, heard, understood, mentalised, and hopefully with the intention of promoting a placement stability for these children. So what they will get is a psychoeducation programme over 10 groups that will involve mentalising exercises, games, discussion, practice in between times, and really a chance to think about the experience of their looked after child, but also to think about their own experience. It's really hard work being a foster carer. It's really, really tough. And we're not trying to pretend that there are some that are brilliant at it and some that are rubbish at it. It's tough for every one of them, even the most experienced. And so this is an approach that really is trying to get alongside them and understand the experience for them of caring for sometimes really, really difficult children. And one thing that we know from the research that I'm not going to go into today just for the purposes of time, but if anyone's interested and wants to read up on it, Jill Hodges has done some really interesting research in this area. So has CASPI, C-A-S-P-I, and also Peter Fonagy and Freud, that shows that actually even the most mentalising, reflective carer in the world, when they're looking after a child who's had an experience of really quite severe trauma, their own capacity to mentalise goes right down. So there's an impact on the carer of their ability to be able to be thoughtful about children's needs. And we know that from the adoption studies. So we're really using that research, and we're really trying to say, well, what can we do to help bring that mentalising back online? How can we bring carers who have this very traumatised child in their house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and really at times might not even like that child one bit, how do we get them to connect with the child's experience? And the way that we're trying to do that is through this programme. So it's 10 sessions, it's 3-hour groups, it's quite a long time. We give them lots of breaks, lots of activities. And what we're really testing out at this stage is just how feasible this programme is. We don't know if it works yet. We have a lot of evidence that says programs that are based around attachment theory help children with emotion regulation, and that in turn helps children to manage their behaviour, but we just don't know yet whether this approach with foster carers in this style is going to really work. We hope it does. But our aim is to really do a feasibility trial through these 2 sites and see whether or not at the end of that what we get is that foster carers have a better understanding of their child primarily. But a secondary aim is that we want foster carers ultimately to lead these groups themselves. So where the future of this programme will get to, hopefully, is that we'll have some foster carers who get really good at doing this. They really learn a lot from the group, and then they can go on to run their own groups in their areas. And that for us would be an excellent outcome.